carbon gain, schmarbon gain there. I feel like the conversation on this topic of climate change has been so bought and sold. Anyone who picks it apart should feel like this is stupid.
Carbon is not evil. Carbon is an element on the periodic chart. There's just something about those technocrats that feel like they can do it better than nature.
Over the past couple of years, many of you have become more conscientious of where your food comes from. Maybe it's for political reasons or environmental reasons. Maybe it's because of food security or you're concerned about food sovereignty. Whatever your reason is, you've been drawn to pay more attention to where your food is coming from, how it's being produced, and what its impacts are. Today I'm going to share an opportunity with you that you can get involved with that I think will address a lot of those concerns. I would urge you to pay very close attention to what we're talking about today, and then follow the links in the description below to find out more information. Something I've been trying to do recently is bring in different perspectives, different viewpoints, people of all different backgrounds. Today's conversation is between 3 different people, all with different political beliefs, all with different backgrounds, but one common goal. I would like to invite you to take action with us today. Listen to what we have to say, and then check out the links down below. Will, obviously you're a 4th generation rancher. You've been farming yourself for 60 years. So I understand your commitment to farmers. Finian, you weren't a farmer. You're not a farmer. You were on America's Got Talent. What got you into becoming an advocate for farmers?
Well, I've been an environmentalist and an activist for most of my life. My profession was in the music industry. But a lot of what my passion was around was helping where I could. And I thought I knew what there was to know about the solutions we had before us to solve some of the crises. But everything I was looking at was so mediocre in terms of actually solving the crises. Just like, okay, we're going to go off the cliff slower. When I stumbled upon soil health and regenerative agriculture, I had a pretty good science background and soil background, but I was just flabbergasted. I was like, how did I not know about this? And it was so immediate. I watched Graham Sate, who's a soil expert and a trainer from New Zealand and Australia, 4-hour lecture, and he just broke it all down. And I was like, if I didn't know about this, probably most people in the world don't know about this. And literally went back that same night and dedicated my life to helping get the message out. It was that clear, because it was like, if this is all true, I feel obligated to help get the word out. And that was about 10 years ago. And so farmers, I immediately started introducing myself and getting to know these leaders in this community and saying, how can I help champion what you're all doing? Because I can help make a bigger voice for this, at the very least. Yeah.
Well, this Regenerate America Farm Bill, could you explain to us, Finian, what the Farm Bill is? Because I'm sure our viewers, some of them probably know that we have a Farm Bill that comes out every couple of years, but do you mind kind of giving us the background of that?
Yeah, and maybe Will can add some things. He's been involved in more Farm Bill fights than I have. This is my first. But the Farm Bill is a piece of legislation that gets passed every 4 to 5 years. It almost always gets passed because what's in it is pretty necessary for farmers, both and also for low-income folks to have access to things like food stamps and others to make food accessible. But this piece of legislation is very big, and it dictates a lot of what happens in American agriculture. And it has really shaped this commodity-centric exploiting and extraction-based agricultural system that we have has been designed so that we can be a major exporter, and hasn't actually been designed at the basis to help regional communities of farmers really make out better. But the Farm Bill impacts all of us every day because we all eat, we all are impacted what's being produced on our land. So it impacts our food, our water, our air, and ultimately everyone and our children. So this is why we said, okay, we got to tackle this. If we're really going to change agriculture and help regenerative ag, the Farm Bill does have to change ultimately. Otherwise, we're still supporting the ag as usual.
I don't want to get too deep in the weeds with it, but it might be a little bit helpful to understand the history of the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill was a very Southern piece of legislation. The what was true in the 30s, 40s, 50s is that we Southerners elected our senators and representatives for life. So, all of our guys had super seniority. And the South was a very agrarian economy. So our very senior senators and representatives sought the primo committee for them was the Ag Committee. So they dominated the Ag Committee for many, many, many years, which wrote the Farm Bill. And if you look at the history, the really lucrative Farm Bill crops were Southern crops: cotton, sugar, tobacco, rice, peanuts, Southern crops. That's all of that politics has changed a lot. But during that transition, in my mind, the Farm Bill went from being written by Southern politicians to being written by lobbyists for big ag. And I truly believe that pretty much nothing gets in the Farm Bill or has gotten in the Farm Bill for the last many renditions that wasn't literally written by the lobbyists for big ag and big food.
Yeah, and it's thank you for that, Will, because the original intentions of the Farm Bill arguably are quite good to make sure that we're protecting our natural resources and not having as much erosion, soil loss, et cetera, but also helping farmers not be in the pickle of making sure that they can actually have a competitive advantage. But as Will's saying, over the past many, many years inside of the Farm Bill, Big Ag has had the final word. And that's part of the thing we're trying to change with Regenerate America, is to make sure the voice of the farmers, especially those leading in regenerative ag, are actually getting to be able to make their voice heard on behalf of all Americans, but also on behalf of all farmers.
I have to apologize to you, Finian, because my initial thought when my wife told me about it and she said I should review it was, oh, great, we're going to have another one of those bills that's full of all sorts of environmental wording, and it's going to be restrictive to farmers, and it's just going to make everything more of a nightmare, just like a lot of farm bills have done in recent years. And then I actually finally got around to reading it when she bugged me enough. And what you guys are proposing on adding to the Farm Bill is some really important stuff that I think gets to the core of everything that I stand behind when it comes to farming and what I want to see happen with small farmers. You kind of lay out 4 core principles: regenerate the soil, regenerate economics, regenerate communities, and regenerate health. I think it's important. I was just talking with Roger Rawa the other day from, I don't know if you're familiar with the Flower Hill Institute, but he and I just did an interview, and we were basically talking about the importance of, communities and economies within, the agricultural sector, and how kind of getting ourselves away from these local food sources, these local farmers, and getting into the big commodities. We're kind of giving up our own food security, as we kind of saw with COVID. It also kind of gets into food sovereignty. We're kind of losing control of what we put into our bodies, and for some people, they don't even have access to healthy, good, nutritious food. And so a lot of these points that you're making here, from soil to economies to communities and health, are all some things that I spend a lot of my time talking about. You list off several crises that you're trying to help solve. The first one was farmer livelihood. Will, what are your thoughts on farmer livelihoods today? But when you look at some of the things that are happening out there right now, you've got a lot of farmers having to give up their livestock because of drought conditions. They're having to put down entire orchards that take years to regrow. Is there a concern that these farmers are strapped in debt and won't be able to make it through this current cycle that we're in?
What we need to recognize is that industrial farming is a very high cash outlay, high capital requirement, very low margin, and but there's very little risk in it. The Farm Bill has taken a lot of the risk out of farming. We used to talk about how risky industrial farming was and believed it, but it's really not. It's just extremely low margin. And in fact, it would be a true statement to say that in most cases, the payments that come from the Farm Bill are the profit that the farmer lives on. The actual production of food and fiber are very, very break-even-ish. The farmer finds himself in a very unenviable position of being between huge monopolies or oligopolies on one side. They get inputs from the Bayers, Nutrigen, John Deere, crop insurance companies, etc. By retail, a lot of money goes into putting in that crop that the farmer spends with those big multinational companies. Then he markets his crop as a commodity to a very small number of big multinational people in big ag, the Tysons, the Cargills, the Smithfields, So it's a very tight margin place to be. And through my lifetime, I've seen those crop inputs go high and high and high, and the amount paid for those commodities to be less and less and less. And the word commodity means meet the minimum requirement. So the quality of the food has gotten less and less and less because the farmer is not incentivized to add quality to his food. It's a race to the bottom to achieve the minimum requirements with the smallest amount of those expensive inputs they buy. It's just a bad system.
If I can add something to that, just a couple of the nuances of, especially right now, when we're talking about soil health and really what we revolve around soil function. And when Will's talking about this race to the bottom and the push that happened in the last few farm bills, we made a little progress the last one, but the last several before that was really this emphasis on like get bigger, get out. And that means like, you're pushing out all your buffer zones, you're making sure you can do as much as possible, maximize your yield. But as your soil degrades, your input costs have to go up, both your pesticides, your herbicides, your fungicides, but also all of your fertilizers go up. And now in this last couple of years, we've seen with some of the catastrophes that happen in the global markets, like these input costs going up another 3 to 4 times. So when most folks think about, oh, wow, you're getting this big yield, that must be a great kick home. When you do the cost and analyzation sheets for input costs for farmers, and I'm not a farmer, but I've seen them. I've seen that in these spreadsheets, the astronomical input costs are quite alarming. And that's what Will says, this tight margin that farmers are on, and now oftentimes are like banking on some bailouts or here or there. And that's not a healthy system. And so what we're looking at with regenerative agriculture, why it's so important is because it is a trajectory of rebuilding soil health, which fundamentally will allow farmers to reduce input costs and become less vulnerable to like, I have to have these high inputs. They're taking themselves off the drug, so to speak, so that they can be more independent. And then that crop that they're getting does have a better end of the day outcome profit for them. So this is a big part of making this economically viable for farmers in the long run, and not just having the government be, oh, it's more money to put in, more money to put out for all of these folks. So I think all in all, we're saying that the promise of regenerative agriculture and building soil and having farmers and ranchers do that is at the core of this.
And that kind of goes into the resilient crisis that you guys mentioned on the introduction of the bill, talking about degradation and erosion of soil and the lack of resilience with farming. You and I kind of had a talk about this the other day. This bill doesn't directly reference climate change a whole lot. What you guys are putting in there, you're focused on soil health and regeneration of soils. And I think that that's kind of important because I feel like the conversation on the environment and our climate has gotten so skewed. Everything gets blamed on one thing, and we're not solving anything because we're focused on the wrong problem. We had an interview that we're going to be airing shortly with Alan Savory, and he kind of said the same thing. We're so focused on the wrong things. We're not focused on doing the right things. Do you think, some of the points that you're bringing up in this bill, do you think that legislators are getting it, or do you think it's still kind of going over their head? Do you think the dialogue of climate change is kind of blinding people from seeing some of the bigger issues on the ground?
Well, definitely. I want to pass it to Will, but that's part of the reason we made the film Kiss the Ground and saw that the arena of communications on this was essential, because you go to these conferences, you hear these brilliant leaders in this movement saying these things, but then you're like, wait, who else is hearing this? And you realize there are people in positions like the Secretary of Ag who like needs help to understand the national security issue of this, of like how dire it is, but also the opportunity. But again, like, yeah, we talk about climate and all these things. It's like, sure, yes. But are we talking about these really practical matters of like what's happening on the ground in these regions that are being impacted? We're not having nearly enough of the conversation about ecosystem function. And therefore, honestly, this is where I think the opportunity for both Democrats and Republicans to take a little bit of humble pie and say, oh yeah, we didn't know, because lo and behold, the smart environmentalists didn't know about the soil health thing anyway also. So just like laying it down to say, look, when we really look at who becomes the champions of the environment, it's the farmers and ranchers who've been leading in regenerative agriculture. Those are arguably the most essential cutting edge thinkers and solvers of the climate crisis. If they're feeling shamed and pushed out of being part of the who needs to be focused on, who needs to be funded, who needs to have resources, that's crazy. So when we're looking at the Farm Bill and saying this is about solving for all these crises, we have to make sure that the people who are actually solving the crises are getting the credit, are being seen, and being pushed to the front, like people like Will. And you just mentioned, Alan Savory. It's like these are people who are out there proving the models across this country. We work with Understanding Ag, who is currently helping transition 32 million acres. Gabe Brown and Ray, who founded that, were part of Kiss the Ground, the film. And over the last 2 years since the film launched, sorry about that. Over the last 2 years since the film launched, they've exploded in terms of who they're able to impact. But again, 32 million acres in helping transition across one country in the United States. That's tremendous. That's just one firm, let alone all the work that people like Will here are doing. But it's happening. We're getting a lot of folks who are seeing this solution. And one of the things I want to impress upon this audience is both sides of the aisle, staffers and members alike, they are getting this. They are having the light bulb moment go off of like, oh, soil function. I get it, right? It's happening. So all of us can be on this movement together.
There should be no doubt in any thinking person's mind that agriculture done right, regenerative agriculture, is part of the solution for mitigating climate change, not part of the problem of climate change. You can see it in my. You can step out in my pasture and see it. Finian's been here. You can take a spade, a shovel, a spade, and turn over a shovel full of soil and see it. We're lucky enough to have had a very expensive environmental impact study called an LCA, life cycle assessment, done here that somebody else paid for, that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that we are sequestering 3.5 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent for every pound of grass-fed beef we produce. It's on our website. You can look at it. The third-party environmental engineering people. So that there's no doubt it should be a real centerpiece of the argument, but it's not, and probably won't be. It's contributory. But there's so many multinational companies making so much money selling the inputs for industrial farming that you don't want to believe something if you believing it will get you fired. So that's a hard sell, and these are people that influence politicians. So that's hard. In the case of the scientific community, great people in the scientific community, but they bicker endlessly over how to measure carbon, bicker endlessly over the scientific methods of how to do it, when what really matters is you're doing it. And I can go on and on, but climate change is real important. The mitigation of climate change is a great component of what we ought to be able to brag about, but it's been very difficult to use it to push the ball down the field. What we found to be most efficacious is the enrichment of the rural community. That's something that just about everybody can get behind. And there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that centralized agriculture impoverished rural America. You don't have, I don't care what city you're in, you don't have to drive very far in one direction to go through ghost towns or towns are in decay, in decline because agriculture left. And then industrial agriculture just left poverty behind. Industrial agriculture rendered rural America to be economically irrelevant. And so it wasted away. There are great cases, we've got one, other people have, showing that when agriculture is done right, it enriches rural America. I'm sitting in the middle of a town of Bluffton, Georgia here, and it was literally a ghost town. The only thing you could buy in Bluffton 15 years ago was a postage stamp if you got there between 1 and 3. Today, this is a nice little town, this little destination. And the only change is the way we started farming. My payroll went from $50,000 a year to $5 million a year, and everybody's boat floated on that rising tide.
A lot of times, I'm accused of being a climate denier. My thoughts on climate are that it's a lot more sophisticated than just a simple answer. And I think that whether you're looking at anthropogenic global climate change or you're looking at just natural climate change cycles, one of my fears is that our soil has reached the point where it's so depleted that we can't even handle a natural cycle anymore. I mean, the second we have any change, if you look at the numbers of industrial ending stocks for food since the last 6 or 7 years, it hasn't been improving. It's actually been decreasing on some years. And a lot of that has to do with our inability to increase yields. And when you really get down to it, a lot of it comes down to the health of our soil. And you look at the input costs. So I just wanted to throw that perspective in there because I know, a lot of people look at these things differently, and I think that there's a lot of science involved in it. But when you get down to the heart of any argument you want to come from at this, regenerative agriculture is kind of at the heart of it.
Yeah. Can I add a nuance there that I think is important? And I'm glad Will talked about the studies that have happened on their farm via carbon sequestration. But I think that I represent a pretty probably liberal setting of things in my life, but I feel like the conversation on this topic of climate change has been so bought and sold with like just carbon calculations when it comes to like, we're talking about the impact of climate change, how it's going to affect us all. The conversations are so linear and non-holistic that anyone who picks it apart should feel like this is stupid. And that's where it's like, we've set ourselves up with like climate change, CO2 in the atmosphere is causing everything. You're like, no, broken land across the world, Syria, I give this example. It's like, look, you can't just be like floods and droughts in Syria are caused by climate change. Be like, they nationalized the land in the 60s. People who never managed extremely brittle land took over land. Not to say that was a bad thing, but they didn't know how to manage it. In 10 to 11 years, they degraded land so quickly. And then huge populations shift to the cities with very vulnerable, degraded land out in the countryside. And now there's flooding and drought after flooding and drought and tons of people moving away. You're like, you can't just call that on heating up of the environment. Obviously, that's exasperating. It's making it worse. But the land got broke and it needs to be fixed. And the thing is, we can repair it. That's why regenerative agriculture is so important, because we talk about floods and droughts and these things that are being accentuated by climate. You're like, well, at the bottom level, if it works again, the land, meaning it functions again, it had to function because you took material that was in the air called carbon and rebuilt it. The glue that makes the soil function has to come from the air. All the grasses, all the trees, all the underground roots, all of the exudates, all our carbon. So you need carbon to rebuild how it works. But if it works again and you get a 5-inch rain event because some big climate caused rainstorm, you can infiltrate all that rain and it goes down into your aquifer and recharges and comes out as clean water in your springs versus a huge muddy flood that kills a bunch of people. So I feel like the framing and the opportunity that regenerative agriculture has and soil health has is that we're talking differently. When you start from soil health function, you grab a different perspective. You're immediately talking holistically, which I think cools a lot of people's like, never going to talk about carbon, always going to talk about carbon. Be like, doesn't matter. Let's talk about function. Let's talk about land healing.
Yeah, we live in a carbon ecology, so it's not. I've always told people it's not. The carbon's not the problem; it's the solution. It's just how we're utilizing it to our benefit. But we have, and I don't know if anybody's, because the calculations of carbon have always been debated, but I don't know if anybody's looked at this. But if you look at how much our soil has been depleted, a lot of that has been erosion as well. It hasn't just floated off into the atmosphere. Right. If we were to pull carbon down, you might actually find that there's a deficiency of what's available to us if you were to be able to regenerate the soil on a mass scale quickly, which I don't think would happen. But that's kind of I think it's interesting how we can try and get the cycle back to working again. And when you were talking about floods and you're looking at some of the drought conditions out west, and you look at the snow melt we've had in the last couple of years, and the fact that we can't seem to retain a single drop of it for half of the season, a lot of that is because of the soil that we're trying to put it into. It's not going into the ground. It's just gone. And that's, I think with everything else, with your other crises that you've listed here, the food crises, the biodiversity crises, all of these are, intertwined with that same purpose and reason. And I think that's one of the things that we're hoping we could help people understand. Biodiversity, though, how does regenerative agriculture increase biodiversity?
First, let me say that I agree with this overstated focus on carbon. I mean, and now I'll answer your question. So there are the cycles of nature. That's what's so important here, the cycles of nature. What's important to understand is industrial, linear, factory farming, monoculture farming breaks the cycles of nature. And the carbon cycle is one of those cycles. It's not the most important. It's not the least important. They're all of equal importance. You got to have all of them. You have to have a liver and kidneys and a heart. And we have to have a carbon cycle and an energy cycle and a water cycle and a mineral cycle and a microbial cycle and probably some other cycles that we don't even recognize. So what regenerative agriculture is restarting those cycles of nature, the carbon cycle being one of them, in order for the land to yield the abundance, for the land to grow healthy again and yield the abundance. Carbon is not evil. Carbon is an element on the periodic chart. It's like phosphorus. It's like 100 and something of them. But what's happened is we have depleted the carbon in our land, the practices, the technology of ammonium fertilizer, pesticides, tillage have liberated all that carbon, not to mention the fossil fuels we put up now. So we are overburdened with carbon, gaseous carbon in the air, and underfed with solid carbon and liquid carbon in the soil. One of the things that scares me to death about all this focus on carbon is some Nobel Peace Prize winner is going to invent a machine that'll pull carbon out of the air and put it on an ingot that we can stack in a warehouse. And that's not a cure for climate change. He got the carbon out of the air, but didn't get it in the soil where we need it. So we use the term holistic. Holistic meaning in consideration of everything. This very linear factory farm model that we have embraced for the last 80 or so years has given us incredible efficiency. It's very linear. You can be scaled up. You get incredible efficiency. It did so at the expense of resilience. You mentioned that earlier. We traded all of the resiliency for efficiency, and it was a bad deal. It was not a good deal.
Yeah, and we're facing those consequences. And then when it comes to biodiversity, I think it should be shocking to everyone, the rate of what we're losing. And why I think it's important, and I think this is a common ground issue here, pun intended, of course, here, is that, and what I mean by that is there just shouldn't be any argument on either side of the aisle when it comes to this, because we all know inherently from the time we're a kid, like when we step into areas where the birds are singing and the bees are there and it's flourishing, that is how it's supposed to be. When we step into a landscape that's silent, we all know that something's wrong. And that's why when people are in that, it heals. I mean, there's just so many phenomenons when you're in that, when it's right. And the incredible thing about regenerative agriculture, I want to share a few things, but the rate at which we can regenerate and restore biodiversity is unbelievable. I just want to say it like that because it really, really is. When you think about how fast, for example, you can take very degraded corn, soy rotation, depleted 0.5% soil organic matter, dusty field, and over the course of 2 or 3 years, convert it to an operation of livestock production where you're doing rotational adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And then all of a sudden you're getting flower species coming back, different native plants coming back. What a lot of people forget is that there's a latent seed bank. What latent means is basically waiting for conditions to be right to come back. So when we have seeds and spores that are waiting for the right conditions, they're dormant until the right conditions. When you start getting regenerative ag, introducing livestock grazed properly, you're going to allow those things to come back. As soon as they come back, you're getting different exudates pumping into the ground, feeding different microbes that are feeding different other microbes. And then the cycles of the soil biodiversity comes back. And in one healthy teaspoon of soil, remember, you can have more organisms than there are people on planet Earth. Those are feeding bigger organisms. And then you're getting your worms, earthworms are coming back, and you take a shovel full of soil and you're breaking apart and you're just seeing all the earthworms and other things. But there's also billions of other organisms sitting right there in a handful of soil. So when you're seeing what feeds the system, you have to recognize that this is cascading. This is a regenerative feedback loop. So you're like, okay, we have a latent seed bank that's coming back, meaning plants that have been waiting for a while, they come back, their deep roots are exuding sugar into the ground. They're feeding microbes. Those microbes are feeding other microbes. That is allowing for more glues to occur. Those glues glue the soil particles together, making some more rain can be held in that soil. More water can go into depth at that soil, making that water exchange be possible. That means you have more water and nutrients available for your plants because the microbes make the nutrients available for the plants. Those plants are going to grow bigger and have even more latent seed banks come up, and they're photosynthesize even more. So they're pumping more sugars into the ground. So you have this regenerative feedback loop that, lo and behold, all those species of native perennial grasses and flowers and all these other forbs that are coming back, and the pace at which they come back, you're bringing back biodiversity. You get your bees, you get the birds, and all of a sudden you have an ecosystem back. I'll end the story with one of the most shocking revelations hearing from Understanding Ag, who I mentioned is helping manage over 32 million acres, was one of their number one recommendation or request, why they're getting requests from large landowners and land managers in rangeland, is to get their birds back. It's literally emotional owners of land or farmer, rancher, landowners or the managers saying, we want to do this because we want our birds back. You would expect that this is a financial thing first and foremost, but to know that that's the number one, number two reason why these larger managed, 500,000 acre type of deals or 7,000 acre type of deals, because they want their birds back. You can get birds back. This is what, the Audubon societies, other people being like, we want to talk about conservation. We want to talk about saving these species. Regenerative agriculture, regenerative rangeland management. This is the proven methodology, because you overgraze it, they leave. You turn it into cropland, they leave. But if you go regenerative, they're coming back in a pace that is just mind-boggling. So,
do you? Is it possible to be successful at regenerative agriculture without having the livestock?
Yeah. I mean, it's all context based, but not as easy. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I would argue that truly degraded land cannot cost effectively be regenerated without animal impact. You know, if you every ecosystem that I'm familiar with had animal impact in its evolution. If your grandmother had a great chocolate chip cookie recipe and you wanted to emulate it, and you did, and you put everything in except the sugar, it's not the same chocolate chip cookie. And to bring life back to an ecosystem and to leave out one of the primary impacts, which would be animal impact anywhere you are, it's not going to be the same pound cake, not going to be the same cookie. So can it be done? Yes, it can. You can haul enough animal manure from point B to your degraded field to bring it back. You could do that. Can you cost effectively do it? I would say that no, not at scale. No. And
one thing I think that people,
a lot of it.
Well, I just want to add to that. One thing people forget is that everyone who's not using animal impact is mimicking animal impact, or actually literally just taking manure or something from animals, or like trying to emulate it exactly. It's like, you're trying to do it. Why don't you just use animals? And again, there's this context specific. There's regions in this world where, livestock just doesn't make any sense. You're just totally naturally supposed to go towards a forest system, and you can implement that and go. But then there's also these other factors where you're like, okay, in some of these places, if you're going to be doing agriculture, if you're going to be trying to produce a product, to have the best performing product there, you might want to go silvopasture versus just like, oh, I'm going to plant a forest of monocrop forest that I harvest 20 years later. Be like, that probably wasn't as good for the ecosystem and biodiversity and watershed management and your actual economic health than implementing a system that's doing more to rebuild and regenerate faster. So why not? So I think there's a lot of these like agroecology systems, agroforestry systems that do work without animal integration. But in most cases, there's some animal present doing something to make it work, or some simulation of that.
Let me give you a more practical application than baking chocolate chip cookies, although that's a pretty damn good one, if I do say so myself. But a more practical one is, everybody understands the benefit of planting a cover crop, not leaving the soil lying there, nude, exposed to sun, radiation, starving your microbes. Leaving bare soil is a bad idea. So everybody, any thinking person would believe that cover crops are good. And then after we grow these cover crops, if animal impact is not involved, we try to incorporate that residue that we grow back into the soil. And all sorts of beautiful technology has been invented to push it back down in the soil, roll it over, mulch it down. And it does some good. There's no doubt about it. It does some good. But think about this. Is that plant material that you grew in the cover crop, that plant material, is it more available to those microbes if it's eaten by a cow and spends about 3 days in that 40-gallon fermentation tank and then dumped back down on the soil as manure, or if it's just mowed down and dropped back on the surface? Well, and the difference is that manure is liquid, not liquid like solid liquid gas, liquid like the money in your wallet. It's very liquid. You drop that, when it falls out of that cow, it's immediately available to those microbes, already partially digested for them. When that same plant residue comes out the side of that mower, was pushed down by that mulcher, a huge percentage of it, maybe 70% of those nutrients are going to volatile, oxidize.
Well, I read your I read your Will's Wisdom vlog the other day, and you were answering the question of whether or not Bill Gates should own as much land as he has. And you mentioned a Nobel Prize winner earlier, which kind of spurred this thought in my head and made me ask the question about animals, because apparently he's created fake microbes, or he's working with one of his companies is creating fake microbes to mimic the microbes of animals in the soil. But it's my understanding that from the research we've done, we're doing a bison documentary right now, that even in a forest climate, the large ungulates play a significant role in the forest health. And it goes far beyond microbes. It's not just the digestion of the plants or the pounding of the ground. There's a lot that goes into it. And so just simply taking them off and trying to invent other man-made ways to replace them, it doesn't seem like a very viable option to me in the long run.
It's just something about those technocrats that feel like they can do it better than nature. There's just some hubris, some arrogance that makes we humans, especially a certain kind of human, believe that nature's just not really as good as she can be, and we can do it better. And that almost always has unintended consequences.
Yeah, and I wanted to just throw out we were making years ago, we were making a short film called The Soil Story, and we were just looking at like the millions of years of research and development. You want to put it that way, of like everything in the nature is automatically, based on everything we've proven, is automatically working its way to better. Like that's just how it goes. It's competitive nature. Everything is like working to go better. And you argue with like, okay, your company is advertising 25 years of research and development. We're talking about like 450 million years of research and development here, folks. That's like so intricate. You're talking about fungi. Like if you get a cow and dung and urine on a cow, what that does for a degraded landscape, allowing mycorrhizal fungi to exist, the extent that it can go out and between cow pies, even in a deserted landscape, what's happening under the ground that can support itself because there was pee and dung and around that field. Mycorrhizal fungi, for those who don't know, is like the universe internet connector, distributor of information and nutrients under the ground. If your system is allowing that to happen, you're not actually creating a high fungal dominated epic soil ecosystem. Another thing to think about is like all these things like dung beetles. Without dung, you don't get dung beetles, and you don't get what happens when they are doing that. Like we all know that beavers are good for making watersheds function again, but not enough credit for things like dung beetles that are like teeny versions of building. Yeah, they don't build a dam, but they build holes in the ground that like, people go out in their front lawns and like make holes in my ground type of tools. But it's like, we have nature's invention of it is so perfect because everything had to fall into place in order to make it happen. So there aren't unintended consequences. And if there are, you just need to build more life into the system. There's a great little documentary I'm sure you've seen, which is The Biggest Little Farm. And they're, just starting out on this venture, less years than Will's been in it. But it's that thing. It's like, if something's going wrong, you just need more life, and you got to figure out what those niches that need to be filled are.
Yeah, we've actually been kind of experiencing that on our own farm, that, the more we've tried to get away from pesticides or anything else, and now we won't even touch pesticides because we have bees on our property, and you keep running into these challenges each season growing. We're getting closer and closer, but every time we're like, oh man, we need to bring this in now, but now we've got ducks and, it just keeps growing. But I love the diversification in my daily life personally, but I have one more question for you guys, and then I think we should probably cover some of these priorities so people know what you're wanting to put into the bill. But how do you feel programs like carbon banks and carbon credits are impacting the agricultural industry? Do you think they're positive, or do you think that they have unintended consequences themselves?
Yeah, I feel like there's, again, we'll call it sex appeal or whatever we want to call it, tech appeal. I think we call it tech appeal, probably makes more sense. But humans are infatuated with this stuff because it's what's in current mind. Somebody's benefiting somewhere across the line to move and be a middle person and like make the wheels and deals. But at the end of the day, right now, we desperately need land managers to be incentivized to recover and rebuild our land collectively as humans. Like, we've messed up the earth and we need to repair it. Who better than people who are managing that land to be able to be empowered to do that and incentivized to be the heroes that we really need right now. But one thing with, the siloed thinking and the unintended consequences, if we just go carbon, while carbon is the means, again, it's not the end. The end is regeneration and function and abundance, right? Like, that's what we're going after. Carbon is that means because we need it to make it happen, but it's also a really hard thing to track. And in some circumstances, especially with the droughts and floods that we're facing more regularly, it's going to be even more frustrating to monitor. So you'd be like, oh, we got carbon gains year one. Next year, we're not getting carbon gains. Does that mean we lost all that money we were going to have? And then you go to context and you're like, okay, here I am out in the West Coast and it's brittle and dry. And what do we need? We need our water to slow down and seep into the ground. That will be huge. And we need more animals on the land. We need this cycle to work again. A carbon gain, schmarbon gain there. You're not going to gain more carbon in California tomorrow than you're going to lose by burn off and soil erosion. So why don't you start with the most important thing there is like, how is water moving through this landscape when we got it on our landscape? How are we making sure it's leaving through a plant, evapotranspiration, et cetera? But we're like infatuated with carbon. So they're like, oh, let's look at how we can look at how much carbon gains we got. Yeah, if you're in Minnesota and you can rotate your cows this many times, you're going to win the carbon game because you can sequester boatloads of carbon in your grazing system. And that's not a fair system. So should that person be paid less because it's easier for them to sequester carbon? I don't know. But in New Mexico or California, someone should be paid for what repair they're doing. If there are going to be markets, we should be like, what is the most necessary repair that this person's doing for their local area? And again, if it's functioning, if we're building the soil, rebuilding the soil, it absolutely requires carbon. So there's always going to be carbon gain if we're having rebuilding versus soil loss anywhere. So I feel like it's way too many unintended consequences, way too many places where the middle person is the winner versus the farmer. And it's a bit too complicated and it's not available context-wise. I think it is a part of the arrow, maybe one arrow in the quiver of 10 that should be considered as an option, but it's really also hard to monitor day in and day out. So I don't think it should be the end all be all. I think it should be an option for people to look at. And we want to sequester it at the end of the day. We want to have it built in, but it's a really hard thing to have the omnipotent measurement of what we're looking at.
I agree with Finian. I would state it a little bit differently, but I'm in full agreement. Excess carbon in the atmosphere is not the problem. It is a symptom of the problem. The problem is ecosystems that are not functioning properly, and the excess carbon going up is one of the symptoms. I mentioned earlier a machine that would suck the excess carbon out of the air and put it into bricks is not going to correct the real problems of the cycles of nature being broken. If you have it's like checking to be sure your liver is operating great, but you've got heart disease. So the things that I would and which I mentioned earlier, the measurement of the carbon is very dodgy. There's a lot of different ways, approaches, and I don't think any of them are really, really, really good. I wish that the incentives for just increasing carbon could go towards improving the health of your ecosystem. And that would include all those cycles I mentioned earlier. And I'll make one more comment about this carbon market. We have had some really big players come down here, transportation companies, people that are really in the spotlight for putting carbon up, that have the need from a public relations perspective or shareholder perspective to get credit for pulling it back down. And it is incredible to me how many pounds of carbon they admit they need to pull down to be carbon neutral. And so many farmers believe they can sequester carbon that are not going to be able to. When you get serious about really getting the cycles of nature operating, which means sequestering carbon, you're talking about changing that industrial commodity model so much. You know, if you continue to till, you won't sequester carbon. If you continue to use large quantities of ammoniated fertilizer, you won't sequester carbon. If you use pesticides in quantity, you won't sequester carbon. So I think we're missing a lot of boats here on that whole discussion. What we should be talking about is ecosystem health. And I'll say this, so it does start with the soil, but it's not just about the soil, it's the whole ecosystem. The soil is the heart of it.
I agree with what you guys are saying on that. And I think the other problem is one that you just kind of mentioned is you have a lot of corporations. We've seen this, especially in other countries that are a little further along with their carbon credit programs, a lot of corporations coming in and then competing with farmers on buying up farmland and other ways of offsetting. And it's actually putting agrarians out of business. I always say that agrarians are first responders to the environment. So it's kind of I think it has a lot of unintended consequences. And that's always, I think when you look at bills and things, I think that's always one of the fears that people have. And so when I was, reading through the priorities that you guys wanted to bring into the Farm Bill, a lot of these priorities are geared around providing resources or just simple access to resources of programs that are already in existence for smaller regenerative farmers, which I think is great. There's nothing in here that's restricting anybody from doing anything. What it's doing is helping to turn the focus and help make resources more readily available.
Yeah. One note on that, the construct, before you jump to that, I just wanted to pinpoint there something. What we were really looking at right now, we're moving out of the phase of regenerative ag, which is kind of considered the maverick phase, if you will, of like very, very, very early adopters. And we're going to the early adopter phase, which means that 15 to 20% of the population of farmers are creeping in to being like, this is interesting. I'm actually seeing some viability in this. I'm actually interested in testing this out because of all of our collective work to move this forward. So the context here was, how are we going to rapidly and widespread help the adoption of regenerative agriculture for that early adopter category? It's not saying that like this is magically going to have the Farm Bill just have everyone do regenerative ag tomorrow when the Farm Bill's passed. It's saying, how are we making sure those people who are wanting and interested in doing this are actually going to be successful economically, have ecological outcomes that are great, but also get the support and the signals from the government that it is trying to help them be successful in this. And it's setting a bar that's making sure they can get access to stuff that is going to help them be successful versus the mediocrity or mid-scale, not so successful transition versions that they've been offered in the past. So I just wanted to put that context in there of where we started from on this.
Yeah. And like I said, I think that's one of the things I like about it is there really haven't been a lot of good resources for the regenerative farmers over the past few years. The first priority you have in there is pretty plain and simple: expand and refine education, technical service, and implementation assistance. There are some TA programs that are out there for other programs. For example, Roger Frawa from Flower Hill Institute and I were actually discussing a TA program for smaller meat processors to be able to open up meat processing facilities, and that would open up the market as far as access for smaller farmers if we had smaller meat processing facilities across the United States. But how important is technical assistance, and what is your goal with priority one? What's your end game?
Sorry, great question. Priority one is really geared around those two words, expand and refine. But I want to focus on the refine. There's a quote that I pretty much repeat on every webinar I'm on. What used to take us 15 to 20 years, we're now doing in 3 to 4. That's from Dr. Alan Williams, who is a part of Understanding Ag and friend of Will's. And what that is saying is that the advancements in regenerative agriculture have been very rapidly increasing in terms of economically what can happen in 2 to 3 years, ecologically what can happen in 2 to 3 years for a farmer rancher who's new to this, if they're getting the right education and handholding along the way. When we recognize that, we're basically saying, okay, so currently we're losing 5.6 tons of topsoil per acre per year under current conditions of tutelage and programming that we have. That's our national average of agriculture soil loss. And she's saying, well, it's not working. So we're not making, because if you compare that to the transition that's happening when people are given education from some of these folks who are on the front lines, they are having economic success, they are having ecological success. So part of what we're saying is we need to both make sure that the education for people who are interested, that early adopter phase, is getting the best education that's actually going to help them from the people who are leaders in this and farmer to farmer type of education. And we have to make sure that those practitioners, those TA providers that exist, also have access to that, because these are folks that may or may not be farmers themselves that are out there as professional TAs that are the connection for a farmer in their training. They need to also get the access to the type of information and the processes and the way that regenerative farming is being successful. We need to make sure that's available for them. So this is saying, like, yeah, it's great that we have all these programs available, but they're not moving the needle fast enough. We need to make sure that the best education is available for all these groups and make sure it's going to be focused on, and the attention to it is going to be more than it's ever been for the USDA. So
this is very much a process. Things are moving fairly slowly, but with the increasingly being embraced. But so many farmers go into this believing that if I get my program right out there managing the land, I am a regenerative farmer, and that's just the first step. We farmers depend on big ag to handle, and I'm the first one to vilify big ag, and I don't want to be thought of as defending them in any way. But they do a lot of stuff for farmers that modern farmers are not prepared to do for themselves anymore. And we talk a lot about the farmer gets like 14.7 cents of every dollar of consumer dollar. But big ag provides a tremendous amount of service. I think they take too much. I think they take way too much. But they provide so much service to the farmer. If you're a farmer in the continental United States and you grow a 48,000 pound truckload of anything, oranges, tomatoes, soybeans, hogs, potatoes, you can pick up the phone and call Big Ag, and they'll come and get it, and an electronic funds transfer will show up in your bank account. All those costs are externalized. When you go the route that we have gone, Gabe and some of the rest of us, you re-internalize all those external costs and all that learning curve that you've got to go up to market, to monetize what you've produced. Consumers don't buy hogs and cows and chickens; they buy beef and pork and lamb and chicken. And making those transitions has got to be dealt with. Market access. People don't consume beef and pork and lamb in the same zip codes where we produce beef and pork and lamb. They're consumed on the coast, and we grow them in Georgia and Arkansas and Texas and Missouri. So there are a lot of things got to be handled. A lot of consumers, it's a good thing. A lot of consumers aren't ready to pay more for what they eat. When you cause a farmer to do without the products that take cost out of production, you add cost back to production.
Right.
And I grow tired of people saying, well, you can sell it so much cheaper because you don't buy all those expensive inputs. Those inputs don't exist to raise the costs at the farm gate. They reduce the cost at the farm gate. The externalized costs show up in the Gulf of Mexico down here somewhere, in your health. So there's a lot that's got to be done. This will be a simple transition.
Yeah. And to add to thank you for that, Will, because it's absolutely critical. And some of the things that we've been looking at and really heavily analyzing, and just to give some folks context for this, we put together this priority list, and it took us over a year of getting consultation from countless stakeholders who've been in this movement and pioneers and leaders in it on multiple sides of this equation. But you mentioned something a minute ago, which is that processing conversation. And what Will has been talking about, things of like the external cost here. And we do want this to be available for the early adopters. And we do want to take down barriers, both in regulatory barriers, but also in this transition process. When we're not asking, we don't think it's possible if we ask everyone to be a maverick like Will or Gabe or some of these other folks who are on the cutting edge. We don't think that is possible to have a big enough and quick enough transition of farmers. So some of the things on processing, if you have conversations on the cost, both what Will was talking about, there's that middle of the ground. Right now, processing is held by major companies like Tyson. Other people are like dominating the whole thing and making it really prohibitive to have someone who's like, oh, I have a farm, I want to transition. That means I want to integrate livestock. So I want to have a livestock operation. But now I have to drive, way too many miles, 700 miles to go to a processing facility. I'm back of the line. I don't have any advantage. But if you compare, for example, just small scale processing, which we also need, but just the cost of what can be handled. So let's say you have your own direct marketing scheme for your farm. You're like, oh, we're going to sell this, this, and this. We can't sell everything. But compared to a small scale processor who can say, oh, I can do this for you. It's going to cost you $500 per cow or whatever. And you have to handle how you distribute your whole cow. Rancher, farmer, new person sitting there like, I can't sell on my webpage every piece of this cow. So when we're looking at some of these tactics of expanding medium-sized processing facilities, where you can say, okay, the rancher is going to have, instead of $500 a head to process this, $150 a head to process this, and that medium scale processing place is taking a part of sending out, making sure the rest of that cow is getting a market somewhere else, and it's not all on that farm rancher. So some of these kind of practical piece together processing. So priority 3 is really where we're looking at how are we maximizing both small scale and medium scale processing around the country for both livestock, but also for different types of crops. Because if you look at most of the countries, like, why is corn and soy and corn and soy and corn and soy? Because that's what gets processed in the mills. And we don't have enough places where you can actually say, oh, I want to process my sunflowers. I want to process this. So unless we have smaller scale processing, and it doesn't mean all new facilities, it means refurbishing a lot of places that were closed down. But we also want to incentivize that this is an entrepreneurial market that's driven by farmers and ranchers or those in the community. And it's not just, opening up government shops that are going to get shut down in 5 years because no one's using them. We want to make this based on economic demands. And then, but if, some of our folks who we work with really have analyzed this economic system of, what is it going to mean so that the person who wants to buy this stuff gets a little bit less, they're not paying so much to make this purchasing choice to help regenerative move forward, but they can do so, and it's a little easier. So all of these things are considered when we're really putting together a policy platform that's saying, are we going to advance regenerative agriculture and make it happen, or is it going to take a bit too long? That's really what we've been putting together here. But without the work of people like Will, who've been at the front end of this, it's never would have been possible to begin with. So,
what are your thoughts when you're looking at some of these processing facilities? You're talking medium, small. Sometimes there are mobile units. I know a lot of farmers who would prefer, for the humane aspects, having a mobile unit, so they, especially in the bison industry, so they could put it down in the field and not have to put the animal through any stress. But what are your thoughts on deregulation? Because I feel like right now we have a lot of regulations in there. They're meant to protect the consumer. A lot of consumers don't even know how to research anymore to know what is safe for them. So there is some level of responsibility that is, in my perspective, unfortunately been handed off onto the government. But at the same time, a facility processing 5,000 animals a day is going to have regulatory requirements that are much higher than somebody processing a couple hundred to, in some cases, just a few animals a day. Do you think that there is room for deregulation on the smaller end and still have food safety?
So we built a USDA inspected red meat plant on our farm, a USDA inspected poultry plant on our farm, and we continue to operate both of them every day now. And nobody has been more plagued by adherence to government regulations as we have. I mean, it's been onerous and expensive and combative and a bunch of other adjectives I could probably come up with. But despite that, I cannot support deregulation of food safety guidelines. And that's what we're talking about here is becoming more lax with food safety guidelines. And while I can see some applications for it, every one of those horrible regulations that it cost me a fortune to comply with were put on the books for a reason. They were put on the books because some plant operator somewhere was either stupid or lazy or greedy, and somebody's baby got sick. So I don't think that you will see food safety relaxing of food safety regulations. I think in some areas it would certainly be helpful in moving this ball that we're trying to move down the field. I get it. But, because people are stupid and lazy and greedy, we're going to have those rules in place. And I've seen processing situations that, I didn't want to be any part of. And, it was more stupid than greedy, but still, it doesn't matter. Food, you can't play with food safety.
Yeah, I think that's perfect segment into what I was going to mention is that we're not really, as we're such a big, huge society right now. It's going to be really hard. We looked into that quite a lot to see where there was maneuverability. I think the only wiggle room really is having the folks who are in charge of this and seeing the food safety stuff to have them be on the sides of and be encouraged to be on the sides of the medium, small scale producers more as a context, because it makes their job harder too, to go inspect smaller scale facilities. It's easier for them when the bigger facilities who literally has a person hired whose only job on that facility is to meet with this person who does the inspection. Like obviously the bigger it goes, and that's where when you get the regulations coming in, it becomes easier for the bigger folks. But I think that's where we're looking is saying, how are we going to make sure that it's not over-regulated? Because I think what Will's saying is absolutely true, where we can't just pretend this is magically going to be safe when you're dealing with meat. But again, is it the coming from these institutions? Are they getting the signal from top down, bottom up, saying that we have to make sure this works and is comfortable, more comfortable? Otherwise, your job's on the line if you're going and being mean to these smaller producers just because it's frustrating for you because you have to do a bit more looking around because it's not all oiled and greased here or there. So anyway, the point is that's how we've been looking at this, is trying to see, like, we can't bend around the safety side, but we can make it a bit more practical.
Well, and I think, like I said, there's some necessity to regulations. It feels to me like there are some areas where things might have been overregulated in the past that they could adjust for the size of the operation. But I also feel like we haven't don't have enough smaller operations in out there really pumping away to know where you can make those adjustments, because it's been difficult to get them open. But at least, now after COVID, we're seeing that there's a necessity there. And a lot of this also comes back to the consumer. The consumer is trained to buy whatever's cheap at the store. And, they want that less expensive food because they want to spend their money on cell phones and $6 gasoline and everything else. And so that's, I think a lot of this for small farmers, at least, is always going to come back to, the consumer's involvement in the entire thing. Because if they started buying locally from farmers, it's not that much more expensive. Sometimes you have to buy a quarter cow or half cow or whatever when it comes to meat. They could help rejuvenate that local industry and help increase the number of small and medium-sized processing facilities across the country, because somebody's got to make that investment into those regulatory challenges to open them. And if the market's not demanding it,
yeah, and that's where the partnerships that we've been looking at right now, case studies where it's happening is, look, we live in a combination. We of course want to have this regional marketplaces be really agile and happening, but demand is demand at the end of the day. And if someone's going to make the venture into this uncomfortable situation of starting on a processing plant or whatever, they need to be able to have a bit more guarantee from some of these bigger buyers on some of these other parts of the animal. So, this is where folks who are already having big established enterprises can help, where we're saying, oh, medium scale processor, where are they going to put all these other remains of this animal that are actually going to get used? And is there a place to do that? And so that's where this combination, sometimes, unfortunately, of some of these bigger corporations getting involved is a part of making sure this demand is actually viable to see, because not everyone can navigate that across this country.
And that actually brings me to priority 4, which you're asking for increased access to healthy and regionally sourced food. A lot of folks a lot of comments I read are from people who feel like they can't simply afford to support their local farmer. They feel, as especially with kind of the inflationary pressures that are on people today, they feel like, as much as they'd like to, they can't go out and support their local farmer because of how much it costs, or they're on a SNAP benefit program. And a lot of these programs, there are some, farmers markets that have access to them, but there's not enough direct, farm to consumer access to some of those nutritional programs. And, unfortunately, that there's a very large market there. We just saw with the baby food formula shortage, this scenario play out in real time, where we have, given the contract to one of these mega suppliers, and something went wrong with food and safety. And the next thing you know, the whole system breaks down because it was all put into the hands of a solid business. But so what kind of ways do you see them increasing access for those who are either on those programs, or to help make the consumer farmer relationship more beneficial?
Couple answers here. We had to really look into this, and I think we wanted to make it practical. I happen to have grown up pretty low income, so I very much relate to shopping for net weight at the grocery store, as the way it goes. And I think that it's unfortunately looked over that so many people in this country, that's literally how it's operating, and there's no shame in that at all. And I think sometimes something that gets overlooked too is like, there is context and connotation. Farmers markets and Whole Foods have connotation, folks. Like, if you come from a background that's not whatever has more money, those things have connotation. You're like, that's just not in my world. And I think that's also important to look at. So one of the things we were checking out here is on the procurement side, and also what's available through SNAP is, are you actually serving the markets where people are actually going to go? And it's not just a fringe of that particular economic grouping of folks who are like, who need that. the amount of those folks who are actually going to go to the farmers market, we have to be real with ourselves. Like, where are they, that group, shopping right now? Let's check into that. Where are we shopping when we don't have money? It's not the farmers market in general, even if we have something available there. It's just a bit of a hurdle. So that's something we were looking at, is where are those things made available and how are they influenced in terms of what are they making available? Regionally sourced food becoming more available. And that's where that procurement side, for folks who don't know, most of the Farm Bill, over 75% of the Farm Bill funding goes towards that SNAP program. So therefore procurement leverages, while it is not an easy thing to navigate, that's what we were really trying to look at first here, is where are the leverage points where we can have the food that's being procured or incentivized through the government helping farmers in their transition, or buying from farmers who are beginning this type of transition, or buying from farmers who are just starting the process, and helping regional food markets. Because the context for this whole Regenerate America campaign is, how are we helping the rapid and widespread adoption of regenerative agriculture? So if you go down one route of food procurement on the SNAP side, how is it actually long-term or short-term going to help make people move towards, or help farmers move towards, regenerative agriculture? So that's a bit of that bucket. I forget the other point I was going to make on it, but it's a big part of it, but it's definitely not one of the easier ones. This was one of the harder ones to put together policy-wise. Yeah,
actually, we are trying to finish up a video we shot last year with we call it STL Grown. We're going to try and do one for different cities each year, where we kind of focus on the urban farming environment and how they're growing food and adding to local food sustainability. And the big question in St. Louis that kept coming up was food deserts and access to healthy foods. But listening to people talk, part of the problem is that the grocery stores, when they don't have enough of a market in some of those areas to just be able to provide fresh produce, for example. And so part of this kind of goes back to education a little bit, but how do you? It's something I don't have an answer for, but how do you get lower income people better access to foods, while also creating a market there for the farmer, without making the government the middleman buying the farmer's food and handing it to them? So it's kind of it's a tricky one.
Let me, I live in one of the poorest counties and one of the poorest states in the nation. And I hope that electric cars and vehicles replace fossil fuel burning gasoline and diesel motor. But in my poor county, there aren't many electric cars. And the few that aren't owned by the poorest people in the county. So I don't think there's anything new or unusual about new and hopefully better ways, first customers being people with money. So that's one point. And before I sound like some excess capitalist, I will say this. We make a horrible mistake when we take two of the biggest problems that face us today. One is a damaging destructive food system. Another one is economic disparity. Two huge problems that we face as a society today that need fixing. And the worst thing we can do is put them together and try to fix it. It's two very different problems that come together with poor people buying food. So here's what I suggest. Let people like me and Gabe and some of the rest of us work on this destructive food system. And some of you guys that have Harvard MBAs work on that income disparity. And let's solve these two problems separately, and then we'll be better off. We sell most of our stuff online, direct to consumers these days, but I used to sell the majority of my product at Whole Foods Market. And I would meet my customers there, and they would say, and these are nice people, sophisticated people, educated people, and they would say, oh, I just love what you're doing. I love what you're doing for the animal welfare of the animals and the environment, the stewardship of the land and the rural economy. But what can you do? What can you do to get your product to these people that can't afford it? And it would infuriate me. It would, they were saying, we got an economic disparity problem. Here, fix it. And that's not my wheelhouse. That's not the business I'm in. I'm real good at this, improving this destructive food production system. Some of y'all work on economic disparity. I got enough on my plate.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. And that's just to clarify when we're talking about this is there's a little bit more of a long game here when we talk about this procurement stuff and where currently the leverage points for what is the U.S. government's behemoth of subsidies that are going to help certain types of agriculture. This is more of like the slow turn of the Titanic, right? Where we're saying like Iowa right now, for example, is I believe 85% agriculture land, and they import 90% of their food. It's the second biggest ag state in the union, in the country, yet it's importing 90% of its food because everything has gone towards commodity markets. So, and that's been subsidized by the government, and that the food that's purchased for regulating price and or purchased for getting back for making more available for folks who are lower income. That's a long game of saying, how are we helping to push the needle and say, well, with these dollars, we can start to be the purchaser to lessen the load for folks. So when they go to their grocery store or their mart somewhere where they're looking, there are available things that they can get. And it's not Will's responsibility by any stretch, but the government's saying, okay, well, are we having these folks who are producing this start to help with regional food sourcing? They can be a leverage point, and it's something that needs to be looked at. Otherwise, we're going to continue down this route.
One of the first things that people mention when they talk about the government helping with purchasing regeneratively grown food is look at all the food they buy for schools and hospitals and prisons. And the cheapest food in the marketplace is what goes to schools and hospitals and prisons.
So, the irony of going to hospitals with the cheapest food.
Certainly, arguably 2 of the 3 is where we should be putting our best stuff. Those other guys are already being shut up. Let's don't starve them. Let's just feed them. But truly, that we're light years away from putting good food in those 3 places because the budget's not there. We've got to move the budget from way down here to way down the stratosphere.
And unfortunately, with the Farm Bill, it doesn't go right into the food procurement for schools. So we've been bending around it. That was the hopeful objective, but that's not included in the Farm Bill. But there are ways to leverage the procurement so it starts to head down that direction inevitably, right? And it's more of a long game. So priority 4, more of a long game. I do have to head out at the top of the half hour here. I know we have 2 more priorities to go. We've been going slow here, but
well, no, that's fine. I think, the last couple, we've kind of covered some of these priorities already, but there's always ways to expand on them. The increased farmland preservation and access and historically underserved producers. I do like that you're including beginning farmers of all types when you in anything you talk about with equitable access. It's important for us to remember that, it's a lot of these, the terminology I've seen thrown out in bills can be very subjective towards certain groups of people. But, when we're talking about the poorer areas of the country and rural areas, we forget that there are all sorts of different types of people in those areas that can't go and get a loan to buy land and have access to start a farm. And, Will, you were talking about, letting the MBAs handling the economic problem. But when you start to relocalize food systems and then the farmers start to relocalize where their inputs are coming from, you are fixing that system. I mean, you just talked about how much your payroll has gone up over the years. I mean, that's part of, fixing the system. And having access ability to these programs for all different types of farmers is kind of getting to the root, as well as far as our diversity program problem in agriculture. You know, it's not necessarily the color of your skin. It's the fact that, you know, if you don't have certain credentials or certain work criteria, history, or a certain amount of money, you just can't get your foot in the door anymore. So, and then the last one is talking about crop insurance, which again, you know, I think a lot of, you know, risk mitigation and insurance programs right now probably don't recognize regenerative agriculture and won't cover a lot of the risks that those farmers are facing. So,
yeah, the irony, I'll just touch on that one, and I encourage folks to go to regenerativeamerica.com and check out the details of these policy priorities. But the risk mitigation thing is just gotta come. It's coming in hot and heavy. People are finally waking up to it. But the simplest analogy for something like insurance is why the heck does Allstate do good drivers for Allstate? Because it saves Allstate money, right? And why are we as a community of the United States paying for the riskiest behavior of farmers who are deciding to go up versus the farmers that are actually taking on what Will's doing and making our land more resilient? They're not getting an advantage right now. Literally, they're getting a disadvantage across the board when we really do the markup here. And that's what we're just saying is, like, you know, at the very least on crop insurance, we need to make sure the folks who are de-risking are getting advantage because they're helping all of us. And at the end of the day, we're collectively paying for crop insurance anyway. So that's a simple no-brainer there. And we're actually seeing a connection on that both sides of the aisle. And the last thing on lending, I'll just mention, we're getting some really great strides on lending right now on folks who are taking conservation practices and then being able to defer their loans. So they actually have more capital to invest in things like regenerative practices or conservation practices. So that's a great marker bill that's currently being written right now for and on behalf of Regenerate America by both senators on both sides of the aisle. So that's really exciting. First progress for a marker bill from the campaign is happening as we speak. So that's really, really great. We'll see a final version of that at the end of the month. So
to add to that, I would say that the two greatest constraints in moving more people from industrial, commoditized, centralized agriculture to this more resilient agriculture is, in no particular order, education and capital for financing. But I think those are the two limiting factors. And you've got outfits like Understanding Ag doing a great job training people. We just formed a nonprofit called Center for Agricultural Resilience for training people. Other efforts are popping up so that we're moving towards getting that solved. The other one, which is the capital, we just did a refinance with a company, brand new startup company called Replant Capital. And my credit, my debt was good old boy, cowboy debt. Want to buy a piece of land, go to that little bank. Want to build a building, go to that bank. Want to buy a herd of cattle, go to that bank. And they consolidated and saved us a tremendous amount of money. And they did it, giving us preferential treatment because of our land management practices. So both finance and training, I think, are moving in the right direction. Those are very positive things.
That's our first and last priority of the six. Well, thanks so much. Unfortunately, I have to jump here. It's been a deep pleasure. Will, thanks for joining us as well. But this has been awesome. Thanks so much for having us.